My friends, we're going to take a quick minute to check back in on Swing Miniatures. We've got a bit of a news dump to go ahead and talk about. I'll go ahead and do that preamble. And then we're going to look at the recent points update by the X-Wing Alliance. And then we're going to talk, hopefully, a little bit around one other piece that's connected to the points and list building. So first, let's jump through the news. You may or may not have heard the exciting news from 312 Squadron. That's our friends out of Chicago. They have both launched a podcast that we'll look at in a second, but then also they are officially going to be streaming Worlds at Adepticon in 2026, coming up this spring in Milwaukee. And that's really exciting. That's a big milestone for 312 Squadron. They do really good streams already, and I think they're going to do a really good job. And I've been really enjoying the podcast, which I'll try not to talk about too much yet, because it's on the next screen. But I did want to go ahead and kind of address the elephant in the room here is that we haven't gotten official news on Gold Squadron. Last time we heard from Gold Squadron, they were going to be the ones officially streaming Worlds. And in the announcement, I don't remember seeing anything that specifically referenced Gold Squadron when 312 was going to be the streamers, but I'll check into that again to double check. But yeah, still really exciting for the 312 folks. I'm excited to see them there. I'm not going to be able to make it this year. It's quite the hike from Portugal. But I look forward to going, assuming it happens again next year, and hopefully we'll get on a stream one of these days. Um, yes. And then on the podcast, yeah, there we go. It's on Spotify. I also saw it on Apple Podcasts. Just for those other weirdos like me, on Android, I use an app called AntennaPod, and I really, really love AntennaPod. It works really well. I was able to add this podcast to that. It was really hard to play it though. Like it strangely played full screen and had some issues of being interrupted where other ones don't. But once I got it working, the latest episode I heard was really, really good. This episode 34 was really good. And I believe, yeah, it looks like they're doing a monthly podcast. And it's been great. I enjoyed it. I don't get a chance to watch their YouTube videos very much, but the podcast I listen to when I'm like washing dishes and cleaning house, and it's perfect. It's really good to get some of that meta analysis. I'm still also listening to Sith Takers, but as a listener, you burn through this stuff a lot faster than the creators can keep up with it. So it's nice to have more. So good to hear from them. They're doing a really good job. Shout out to 312 Squadron there. Next up, Infinite Arenas. Our buddies at Infinite Arenas are doing some additional support for Legacy. Wanted to go ahead and make sure to shout out this. This is the Legacy project. They've been working on their own standard loadout or like additional pilot cards. Not standard loadout, they're additional pilot cards for late turncoats and warriors and turncoats that I've done some preview of before talking about those new pilots. And they're officially being listed for pre-order on the Infinite Arenas card store. And they're being listed both the cards themselves and then also the base coat, or excuse me, the base cardboard. And that's really cool too, because I believe nearly all of these are pilots that have not been released before at all. So you're not going to see any familiar names. So you won't have any base cardboard from any other resource that would actually have these pilots' names and initiatives correct. So that's a really nice perk to be able to have. I really want to see more base cardboard provided, so it's exciting to see this because that's something where I could definitely use to fill in my collection and replace some pieces that get lost, right? You get a splash of beer on a base cardboard and it can be in pretty bad shape real fast. So, not that I've ever done that. I actually haven't ever done that, but I could see it happening. Yeah, loving the card store. And just another shout out, they are also still doing the Alpha class Star Wings. We got those both the painted and unpainted one with printed standard loadout cards, with the base, with the dial. Like it's a complete kit fully converted to 2.0 with the additional XWA supported. Mm, no, with the AMG, the last release AMG standard loadouts, and then is that the full art pilot cards? And these are full, yeah, there we go. Some full art pilot cards that were made as part of this release by Infinite Arenas. So that's cool. Would love to see that. And then I did also announce Infinite Arenas just did a launch about their 2026 Patreon gifts, and they have really cool metal objective markers that have the space slug on them. They look fantastic. I really like those. Okay, finally, we're going to go ahead and look at, let's see real quick, actually. Let's switch the order here. We're going to look at the points update, and the X-Wing Alliance just released a points update after just under a month, I believe, since their points release in the first place. This is version 1.1 of the 50 points update. There's been a lot of feedback about how this was really quick, and it's actually a little bit more significant of an update than this implies, even though it's still a fairly small one. Um, but when they first released the 50-point scale, the XWA did say that they were going to be doing as many of these very small kind of um, pulse checkpoints updates as were needed to make sure that the meta was in a healthy, stable place going up to Worlds, and that they were going to do this a little bit faster than not, so that there was more time for this to steady and sort of even out a little bit before Worlds. Now, a shout out here to my buddy Dave, who told me he's got a homebrew rule to help deal with this fast release, and his is, let me see exactly what he said. He's been such a wonderful person to keep in touch with. Yes. So Dave said that he has a house rule where what is it? We've been talking a lot about Dave's adorable dog. Very cute. Keep him in your mind right now. Let's see. Trying to remember exactly what he said, and I should have looked at this, but I believe the rule was, and you can correct me on this, I hope. The rule was that if you have already pulled out the stuff for one of your lists and you haven't gotten a chance to play with it yet, it still counts. You don't have to update to new points until you've gotten a chance to play with it. So you don't have to rebox everything every time there's an update. But even as common as quick as this update was, it is again, it's bigger than it could be, but it's still fairly small. And the goal they've done, the XWA stated goal is to keep these changes, again, fairly small, sooner than not, but fairly small to try to make sure there's a good long stabilization period before Worlds. And they will try to address any kind of problem points long before it causes any long-term issues. So they're not doing changes last minute. We don't want to see any last minute changes before Worlds. That's the worst. So I'm happier to have this than any kind of dramatic changes that could come down the road. Quick notes. I believe this comes from Ollie. Hey everyone, we hope you've been enjoying this brave new world with us. Over the past few weeks, we've gathered a lot of data, including results from several tournaments already using the new 50-point system. Combined with public feedback, we have a clear direction for our first round of adjustments. Yeah, and they're talking about this is beyond the playtest groups. This is hundreds of players across the world playing in competitive events. We're calling these adjustments intentionally as this isn't a shakeup. When we launched the 50-point system, we wanted a couple fine-tuning passes before locking things in for Worlds. Our goal is for the Worlds points document to feel lived in, so making small corrections now helps us get ahead of the issues we've seen with a lot of lead time for people to test things out before Worlds. Nothing has emerged as a major problem or an oppressive force. A few pieces simply overperformed out of the gate, most notably Fen Rao, Defender Vader, and Boba Fett, custom Boba. So we're making light tweaks. Republic sees the most changes, with only one I6 in the faction. We're making Obi-Wan at I5 a bit more affordable in both the D7 and D7, so Delta 7 and Delta 7B, to give Ace-style Republic players stronger options. We're also adding loadout to custom click and swapping prices between Padme and Rick. Padme is notoriously difficult to price. Her ceiling is extremely high if an opponent rolls a lot of eyeballs, but in practice, her ability often triggers only once or twice a game. Yeah, we've historically priced her for her potential, but we're instead trying to make her a more efficient piece, though she will lose access to proton torpedoes, which is probably good. Rick, meanwhile, has been extremely efficient at 10, and a modest bump shouldn't hurt his viability. Those are both pilots who's pretty cool to see seeing play because they had a moment in the sun, but mostly as part of arc spam. And then Rick had a moment long ago. To see both of them come back as kind of favorite pilots in the Naboo N1 starfighters is pretty cool. Like to see that. The Child is another hyper-efficient upgrade. Its drawbacks, granting locks and non-recurring charges, look steep on paper, but in practice they're often negligible, especially in large base ships that can mitigate damage with reinforce. In platforms like Boba, the Child has been performing above rate, so we're adjusting its cost to align more closely with other Force crew upgrades. That's it for this round. We hope you enjoy the changes, and we'll see you on the mats. Reading between the lines on this a little bit. So this point here, that Republic only has one I6, and they do have multiple I6s, but they're all the same name, so you can't run more than one of them. That is, of course, Anakin in all of his different varieties is the only I6 pilot available in Republic. But seeing that flagged heavily implies that Initiative 6 is playing really strongly in the current 50-point meta. So Ace plays really strong, so it's really important to give Republic some extra tools, seeing as how they only have a single I6. I think even separatists have what, two? Because they've got Sunfac and Django. I think that's it, but they might have others. Um, Yeah, so that does put Republic at the bottom, but not as far down as they could be. But still, seeing Obi-Wan get a bit of a points drop, it is nice. Hopefully, he doesn't run away with the tables now. A couple other things too. The N1s are doing well, so it seems that the dodgy AC play of the N1s is also figuring powerfully. And then this note on the child, where like the granting locks and the non-recurring charges, the way the child is kind of mitigated a little bit is that you always have the option not to shoot at the ship carrying the child. And if you don't shoot at it, it doesn't get its force back. So the child crew gives you 2 force points that don't recur unless you defend. So I want to forget if it's defending or actually take damage, but I believe it's defending. But either way, Boba Fett with the child is basically an infinite pool of force because he can spend it, get it back, spend it, get it back. So you can see why it's really, really powerful. And with fewer ships on the board and more emphasis on kill points than objectives, it's much harder to play a game where you win without shooting at the child carrier, which bumps its power level quite a bit beyond where it was. So that totally makes sense. Um, as an aside, just looking at some of the other things I haven't seen that do kind of bubble to the surface. Again, this means that any I6 is worth another look. So Empire has a ton of pocket I6s kind of sneaking around that may be worth another look. They're ones that didn't really see play in previous metas. Um, I want to say Sienna Ree is an I6 interceptor with a downside, but usually is at a budget for that. And I6 interceptor is no joke. But then another piece that comes to mind immediately is tracking fob. Tracking fob, so with fewer ships on the board, and with tracking fob requiring that it be a named pilot, that means that you have a much better chance of getting the free target locks on an actual ship that does not want to be free target locked. So with smaller squad sizes and generics coming back, it narrows the pool of ships that can have the free target locks from tracking fob offloaded on them. So that's definitely another upgrade I would take another look at. Let's look at the points changes. No changes to the restricted list. We mentioned Defender Vader. I don't think that Rebels got any changes, but I'm double checking real quick. And these are clearly marked in the document. Really love how clear it is. And this is dramatically easier than reading the full list of changes. Oh, there we go. Um, okay, so we did actually see Rebel Fen in the Sheathipede. Yeah, okay, so we did see Rebel Fen in the Sheathipede get a bump from 10 points to 11. Still a small bump, still an incredibly strong piece, no change to loadout. That being the I6 coordinate. The Fen Sheathipede was an absolute menace at the end of second edition with what is it, Ghost Fen, and he came back with a vengeance almost immediately when this points drop launched. So a little tweak up was probably important. I still think he's an incredibly powerful piece, and will do just fine. Let's see what else we got. I think there was maybe one other. Yeah, we're already in Imperial. So we're looking for the defender. Yeah, so Vader goes up 1 point to be 22 instead of 21 squad points. I was talking earlier about this one. Defender Vader is such a, I hate to say meme piece, but he's kind of a meme piece where he's not really that iconic of a pilot in that ship. So it's kind of having that be slightly weaker and not as competitive as a piece is just, I feel like, is fine. Like it's difficult to balance because you don't want to point it too expensive to where it can't be played, but you don't want it to be so cheap that it's totally running away with the table. So leaning a little bit on the expensive side makes sense for that, um, especially with so many other versions of Vader so playable. The Defender, yeah, the Defender's definitely one to keep an eye on because Defender Vader is a very, very frightening piece just to do more or less free damage all over the place. Um, and by more or less, I mean just he's very consistent offensively. Now we're looking at Scum, and we heard a couple changes shouted out here. I was a little sad about this. So Custom Fen goes up 1 to 14 squad points, so now only one cheaper than the Armed and Dangerous version, but +2 loadout going up to 7. So that means you can do Beskar and clan training, among other things. I think that still does not give you the chance to do afterburners, which I don't know. I don't know what builds for Custom Fen are really scary. I do really appreciate the increased loadout, especially for the increased squad cost. It still puts him at the lowest loadout of any Fang fighter in Scum, which makes sense in terms of balance, but also in terms of him being like the flagship pilot of the chassis always feels a little bit weird. And that's true of most of your I6 aces, where being that ship at I6 is worth the extra points without upgrades. So the loadout value is quite low, but I do miss being able to do something with these pilots to give them a little bit more oomph. That's the one big downside that I have with loadout value becoming a separate piece is that you can't really build these up to be the ultimate aces that you could before. And I understand why. I strongly prefer the meta with that, but it's a win some, lose some. Yeah, right. Then we see the Fire Spray Boba Fett going from 20 to 21, gaining a single point in cost. No change to slots, so he still has that crew slot and still keeping that 20 loadout value. I think that's fine. So net, the Boba Fett list, and use usually Boba Fett plus one, those lists have become 2 points more expensive, which cuts out an entire squad mate. But still, you can do a lot with that. And if you just shave down some of your pieces, you can still build around that pretty comfortably. Yeah, that's good. It makes sense because those two are just incredibly powerful, especially Boba with the child. Again, I talked a little bit about why that's so powerful in the meta right now. Um, and that being, yeah, Boba plus Fen, the I6 Ace with smaller squad sizes, there's so much less to shut them down. They don't have to worry about as much about objective play. So it's immediately clear why those two in that pair became so scary right away. And it's kind of cool to see that because they're both pilots that you want Scum to be able to fly and do well with. They were quickly nerfed. And then we also see the ST-70 assault ship. This was a surprise. This wasn't mentioned in the notes. You've got that loadout value go from 16 to 18, so plus two. I believe that reflects the increased cost of the child being that iconic crew that goes with the Mandalorian. It makes sense to give them the extra loadout to manage that. The Mandalorian in the ST-70 was not running away with the table anywhere. Um, and generally, I just like seeing that ship have a bunch of loadout to play with because it's a really challenging chassis to build around, and it's very hard to fly. Flies like a sticky brick. And so giving that a little bit of an edge, I think, is totally fair. And it probably also is barely seeing any play, considering how much else you can fly in Scum. Let's see what else we got. Hopefully I don't miss any. Please do shout out if I do. On to Resistance. We've gone through three factions, and I don't remember seeing any changes for Resistance. There's some, okay. So we see Resistance Han and the Falcon lose four loadout to go from 23 to 19. 23 was a really just sky high loadout. So going down four still leaves him with considerable loadout. 19, what is that? Fourth highest? Fourth highest in the chassis, and he's still one of the most powerful pilots there, being that I6. So still pretty good. Then we also see Stomaroni Stark, the A-Wing dialed X-Wing, go up one from 13 to 14 squad cost. Clearly performing very well, and I can totally see why. He's got to be so much fun to fly. An A-Wing just base three attack dice, plus the other stuff you get on that standard loadout is pretty exciting. Let's see what else we're in first order. It really is a small adjustment, and it's really nice to be able to cover this after spending the time covering every single pilot. So I didn't see any changes in first order. Going through all of the seven factions and covering their new points values at 50, that was a lot, and it took so long just to even get to it because it was such an intimidating task. So this, I'm much happier to do this. I should have done this last night. Let's see here. Okay, so no changes to first order or, yeah, no changes to first order at all that I saw. Into Galactic Republic, this is one where we expect to see quite a few changes. And we saw one right away at the Delta 7 Aether Sprite. We see Obi-Wan Delta 7 go down one from 13 to 12 and lose two loadout to match the cheaper squad cost, so going down from 10 to 8. Still good. That's the Delta 7. You can still do a lot with that. The Delta 7 doesn't need as many upgrades as the 7B and still coming in as kind of the budget option. I like him at 12. That's good. Doesn't need that. I was going into that. It doesn't need the same level of loadout that the Delta 7B does, which is funny to say that because I see that it also went down to 8 loadout. So Obi-Wan in the Delta 7B going down one squad point to 14. So still 2 points between them. It's 12 in the Delta 7 and 14 in the Delta 7B, both with 8 loadout. So 2 less in the Delta 7, 3 less in the Delta 7B. That's a little bit tougher to swallow. A 14 cost ship with 8 loadout just immediately is like, which I mean, Plo's there too, and Obi-Wan's ability is really good, and I believe he does have 3 force and all those chassis, so still good, but man, makes you nervous. A little bit of a pucker. Naboo, Royal N1. Again, these points were swapped, so we see Padme cost 1 less, and Rick only cost 1 more. So Padme is now 10 squad points down from 11, and Rick is now 11 squad points up from 10. Padme coming in at 12 loadout, and Rick going up to 16 loadout. So Rick can really carry some juice there. They did mention that Padme now can't carry proton torpedoes. I believe now proton torpedoes are more than 12. So 12 loadout is a good number to work with, even if that means you can't take proton torpedoes. But there's a lot you can still fit in there. Um, and Padme's ability is so cool if you can get it to trigger. So, and then Rick, of course, having that extra loadout, he can take proton torpedoes, and he's got the double talent, which is nice with that much loadout. So go nuts, folks. Good to see Rick back on the board. And then we see Click, custom Click in the Nimbus class V-Wing, get +3 loadout to 17. It's a lot of loadout on a V-Wing. Um, and you can add the configuration to add the bomb slot. I forget if it adds another slot, but there's a lot you can do with that with Talent Astromech mod and potentially payload. Yeah. Let's see what else we got. I think that was it for Republic. So even though Republic got the most changes called out in the opener, it's not really that many. You got what, one, two, three, four, five, with one of them just being a loadout tweak. All right, let's see what else we got. Separatist. This is one that was not called out. We see Grievous go from 12 to 13 squad cost. That's up 1 point. I was a little surprised to see that. I didn't realize he was performing that well, but yeah, there we go. Well, let's see here. And that may be it, actually. That may have been just a very small tweak. Okay, and then I wanted to look at the upgrade points a little bit, and the bulk of these did not change. I didn't even cover these at all in the launch. They felt very similar to what they were in the previous edition, so I just haven't sat down and covered any of this. Admiral Sloane, 50 points. She's literally nerfed out of existence. I think I missed that, and I should have called that out in the first release. Okay, and titles do have a cost. So that is something important to shout out. So like ST321, the Lambda title is 3. I believe a lot of those had become free, but most all of the titles now do have a squad cost. Dauntless is now 4. And then most of those are epic. But the two titles, the Dauntless and the ST321, the titles that are not epic, do both have a cost now. Let's see. Yeah, for a lot of these points are exactly the same. So like R4B11, R5P8, I think those were both 3 and 4, even in the old points-based system. Loadout was a lot less impacted than squad cost, so these were mostly left untouched, give or take. Not looking to use them. Yeah, most of these very, very similar. Let's see, and so we are looking at, let's see, and so titles do have a cost now. Wow, okay. Slave One being very expensive. So the Shadowcaster title is still free. Razor Crest title is still free. Punishing One's still free. Interesting to see those. Mist Hunter's still free. Okay, so actually it looks like most of the Scum titles don't have a cost outside of the Slave One. IG-2000 is free, of course. Houndstooth is 6 because it gives you a free Z95. That's why Nostradapup is free. Um, yeah, and Drost is free. That's nice. Havoc for the Scourge is free. Okay. Let's see. And now we're going into Resistance, and then we're going to look at. I'm just checking on titles real quick. You've got the config for the T70 is free, sure. That would be crazy to parse that on anything. Fireball's free. Ray's Millennium Falcon is free. Okay, so most of the titles are still free. So the Imperial ones are just the expensive ones. And then we're looking FO, and then we've got the combined upgrades. Just checking myself real quick to make sure I didn't miss any changes before. And then we have yeah, there we go. Ahsoka crew is 10, dang. Yeah, there we go. So the child went up 2 from 7 to 9, which makes sense. That's most of the other crew are somewhere between 9 and 10, so that tracks. And the child also grants 2 force, which is really, really powerful, especially in a meta where I called out in the beginning that it's a lot more likely the carrier is going to get shot and be able to use that force consistently. Especially if you put him on a carrier and a ship that you cannot ignore, you're going to get a ton of utility out of those, especially with Boba. So really strong piece in the current meta to put on Boba, even now. You just have to, make some sacrifices with the rest of your build to do that. I see supernatural reflexes also banned out of existence. I just want to go through and see if there are any more of those, just to check on it real quick, because were a couple surprises in here just now. that I wasn't really expecting. But I think really that was it. And yeah, again, the vast majority of these are exactly the same. It would be fun to see some of these get buffed. Moldy Crow's free. Okay. It would be fun to see some of these get buffed. Just play with it and see what happens if some of these lesser used upgrades become very cheap. Like I mentioned, tracking fob, if that became your 1 point illicit, that would be interesting. Although I also called out why it's more powerful now, so probably we shouldn't do that. Okay, so that was it for the points update. And then I do want to take a quick minute to shout out Satellite Uplink on the X-Wing Reddit. Put up this really fascinating post. Winners and losers in the new XWA points using 2020 FFG points. So this is looking at the 200 points cost of late 2.0, which is kind of an interesting perspective to start at. So it doesn't compare to X-Wing to AMG points, it compares to old 200 points. Um, yeah, and so this is kind of coming from a legacy perspective, but it's curious to see this. So this is looking at top tournament performance from 2019 through 2025. Uh, so that's dipping into AMG points. Um, You couldn't build anything from 2022 onwards as the list would cost mid 50s and sometimes close to 60. Okay. So the 50-point scale does allow you to build basically anything from the early metas. Okay, so that's why. So this was trying to build top cut lists from all of the metas from launch until the release of the 50-point structure, but it only worked up until kind of the later metas. All right, so this is almost dipping into 1.0. No, that's still 2.0. That's comfortably 2.0. Okay. 2020 FFG point values became my fixed reference point. They're the most recent set of points that seem to be around the power level of what we can currently buy with 50 points in the XWA system. And that is kind of dialing back to an earlier meta where it's not quite as aggressive. So the power level has gone down, so squads are a little bit smaller and a little bit arguably more strategic. If there's less on the table and more stakes in every individual ship, arguably play becomes more strategic, especially since we've also added objectives. Let's see, where pilots existed in 2020, I took their 2020 points cost and added their 2025 loadout value to get a combined value of what you would be buying. So it's a little bit apples to oranges, but it is a way of, I mean, that makes sense. It's sort of the total points spent on each pilot as an approximation of what you could get in the early metas, because in the early list building systems, there was no loadout value, so it was what you spent on upgrades. So that's going to make it harder to math out because you'd have like a 60-point Kylo Ren, and now you have something very different. Let's see. If a ship used to cost 40 and now has 6 loadout, you get 46 points value when you spend 10 squad points on it out of 50. Right. Okay. So out of 200, it's roughly like a fifth. It doesn't work out exactly, but it's close. So I just wanted to go ahead and read some of this about how this data came out because I really want to tuck into the data. Where configs and titles used to cut points but now are free, I added on as additional base cost to the ship. Okay. Most obvious example is HWKs that now get Moldy Crow title for free when it used to cost 16. Yeah, back in the day, the Moldy Crow title was really expensive. I added 16 to their old pilot cost. Also split Delta 7B and wartime loadout. So split the, okay. And so this is all kind of addendums talking about how much the game has fundamentally changed, especially for specific pilots and chassis, making it a little bit challenging to compare head to head, but still kind of talking about this was thought out. This is all something that was put into the calculation to see if you can compare relative power level between now and previous lists. From that, you can rank which pilots are now giving you the most value in old FFG points when you spend new XW points on them. The average rate seems to pivot around you getting 5 points of FFG for every 1 XWA point. Okay, so this would suggest that with 50 XWA points, you're buying 250 FFG points. So the power level is still inflated a bit from where it was in 2020, but those extra 50 points are usually going to be coming in loadout points for upgrades rather than extra ships. So yes, it makes sense because ships having loadout means that you have more upgrades, just period, because every single pilot can have upgrades where naked generics were a significant part of the FFG point system. All right, let's see, limitations. These are ranked lists by order of how many extra points you get. Okay. This is not a list of the best pilots. Probably close to a most improved list or maybe the best value adds. Loadout values remove flexibility that pilots had before. Some pilots were good in the past because, and I pretty much hit on that. It's funny I go because I made more or less the exact same point with Fen having that very low loadout. Um, some ships were good in the past because they could take particular combinations of upgrades that they can't get now. Loadout values in general are being assumed to be of equal value in this analysis, and we know that's not true, sure. Some ships make great use of every loadout point, and other ships get loadout values they can't really spend effectively. I'm looking at you, Lappin. That mining guild tie with like what 10 loadout they can't do anything with. It's only possible for pilots that exist in 2020. It doesn't help you understand if gauntlets are good, sure, or if any of the SL pilots are good or not because they don't exist. It's a useful reference point for you to compare the SLs, especially the ones that just compile existing upgrades in a new way like the Battle of Yavin ships do. But if you want to know how SL Scorch looks from Battle of Dakar, you have to cost blah 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 blah. Fan article, I like that. Yeah, okay. The game has changed, but let's go ahead and dive into the data. And this I do, so he shouts it out here. Even these limitations, I think there's value and structure from using this analysis as a starting point. Um, and that's a really great point because anytime we go into a new meta, the first thing you reach for is the things that have changed the most, and then also your favorite pilots. So that sort of bubble stuff at the top, and it's really easy to miss some of the things that changed in more fundamental ways. So I really like aggregate data like this that compiles everything because it does really help kind of highlight like, oh, there's more room to work with this than there was. Maybe I should look at that. So like right out of the bat, Captain Sear. I really love Captain Sear. He's actually my personal favorite belly rub Bulbasaur. He's my favorite Bulbasaur pilot, so it's cool to see him get a big buff here. I really like that. And then we've got Wat Tambor, of course, who I don't like as much, but he's doing well. Both of them have gained a significant number of points. They're the highest winners in the entire, looks like the entire Separatist faction. Yeah. Biggest loser is your Hyena, your bombardment drone. The things that overperform to get nerfed, obviously, are at the bottoms, like your generic Nantex, your bombardment drone. Let's see, your generic fire spray, droids. Ooh, the flak Arfok prototype. Interesting. That one I'm seeing perform very well right now in Separatist list, it seems. Fearsome Predator never was played either way. Gorgol. Okay. Um, yeah, and then looking at the top, we've got the non-Grievous Belbelubs. You've got the BBS 32C. You've got Zam in the fire spray. You've got, and I'm not going to go below 4 gained. And Grievous does show up as having actually more value now than he did. Okay, so Grievous is actually in a stronger position. We've got Django is the 3, so those are line. Okay, and then at the bottom, we already talked about this. Okay, and then next up we've got First Order. Our most improved pilots, you've got Kylo and the Silencer, which is interesting because I called that ship out as one that would benefit from the most from having points separated from loadout, because you could just completely flood the field of generics and pump like 30 points of loadout into Kylo. And that was not unusual, actually. So it's a little tricky to put him on this list, but it looks like he's actually gained the most value relative to the others having loadout strip. And that's partly why he shows up as gaining so much, is because of how little he costs now relative to the effective cost of running him before, because he ran so bloated that his value was inflated. His old value is inflated. And that may be true of a lot of these, but he stands out immediately. And we've got Agent Terex and the She Shuttle. Okay. We've got Lieutenant Dormitz. Oh God. We've got the TIE Whispers, and that's a funny one because I don't think the TIE Whispers were even in those points. I could be wrong. I don't think that ship is that old. So that's a little surprising to see that. And then we get another She Shuttle Malorus. It's interesting to put that in there. And then at the bottom for First Order, we're looking at the SE bombers, which definitely weren't around. Okay, so there's some weirdness here with ships that weren't even in those points, but it's still in there. Just interesting. Um, but Petty Officer Thanison and the generic Upsilon take the most significant beating by far, as do the generics TIE FO and TIE S. Well, generic TIE FO, of course, was really cheap back in the day. And then Backdraft gets a nerf. All right, Backdraft in the TIE SF. Okay, next up, we're looking at Empire with Defender Vader gaining 21 points of relative loadout. very similar to Kylo. That's because of the sheer volume of upgrades you had to pump into that thing. So that's most of the defenders are the most improved in Empire. Rear Admiral Shiranu comes in at 7. Similar reason because you load him up with upgrades, but he has enough loadout value now that it's a little bit more fluid because you can still pump the similar level upgrades into him. Howl Runner gained dramatically nice. Duchess in the Striker, Iden in the TIE, Captain Jonas in the Bomber, and Whisper. Whisper gained a lot, and then Faroff in the Reaper. Okay, makes sense. And then at the bottom end, we're looking at the generic TIE Bomber, Valen Rudor in the TIE. Okay. The Alpha Class Starwing generic, the Interceptor generic, the I-1 generic for the Interceptor, and then Night Beast gets nerfed to oblivion at -8. I think Night Beast is pretty strong right now, so that's an interesting metric. But all right, then we've got the Sheathipede. Fen in the Sheathipede gains the most, so he just got nerfed, but he's up there. You can look at this and kind of see, okay, these are ships that actually bubbled up. So like Defender Vader certainly came up and was just nerfed. Um, I don't know about FO. I didn't see any changes there. Grievous comes up as fairly high, so they were maybe a little bit generously valued. So Fen, Sheathipede, uh, Garvin in the Arc 170. You've got Dash. Dash big gain in the YT 2400, the Outrider. Then we got Shara Bay in the Arc 170. Okay. Kraken in the Z95. What a jerk. Okay, then we got Jake Farrell is way at the bottom. The generic K-Wing, the generic A-Wings, Arvel in the A-Wing, and then we've got Esege Taketu, who again I think is doing pretty well right now, but definitely on this metric less valued than he was in 2.0. Then we've got Hera in the B-Wing. Last at the bottom, we've got Miranda, who was loaded to the gills back in the day. I think she was in a two-ship list for a while there. Miranda and I want to say it was Nim Randa was the menace back in the day. Then Resistance, again, Resistance didn't even exist as a faction at the time. It was lumped into Rebels, but let's see what we got here. It's the BTA NR2 Y-Wings. All of them are the top like 6 here. And again, I don't think that existed in the way it does now, but big value there. So the BTA NR2 Y-Wings benefited a lot. Then we've got the Resistance Nodin Jobdry of the Resistance Transport, and then Kaz in the Fireball. He makes the list by a little bit. Okay. Uh, Jimmy, the generic Y-Wing is not great. Poe, Commander Poe, Ray Falcon got nerfed a little bit. The RZ2 A-Wing generic. Okay. A lot of the generics are in this, but they're at the bottom end where their value relative to old school points looks like it's dramatically lower, which kind of makes sense. I really do think that at this time in that meta, generics were a little bit too good. And now we've got a whole different shift that's a little bit harder to figure out where you've got expensive generics with a lot of loadout. So that math just completely negates itself because that again didn't exist. Like you didn't invest points in generics back in the day. So there's not going to be a way to math that out. So a lot of these generics at the bottom aren't really going to make sense in that context. Okay. Now we're looking at Republic. Delta 7 Anakin 7B through the roof at 15, similarly valued just because you would pump him full of upgrades back in the day. Then we've got Anakin in the Delta 7. We've got Rick in the N1 who just got buffed. And then Naboo Handmaiden, the pipped generic. Interesting. Okay. Mace in the 7B. And then at the bottom there, the ones that have been gotten the worst. We're looking at the V-Wings, Click, Contrail, and Oddball V-Wings, the Arc 170 generic, the V-Wing generic, and then the Torrent generic, and then finally the V-Wing generic. Yeah, okay, so all those generics got wrecked. And then Goji just barely missed the cut. Interesting. Ooh, and then we've got Scum, Boba coming out the best, who has a really good value right now relative to the total. Again, same story as the others where he was buffed to heck with upgrades. We got Cad Solas coming out in higher value, and then Fen in the Fang. Cad Solas, the Fang fighter Cad. And then we've got Dalen in the Star Viper. I haven't even looked at him, so I guess that's one that pops up. It's a little surprising. Emon and Kath in the Fire Sprays, and then Guri in the Star Viper. Oh, and then finally we've got Drea in the Y-Wing. All right. And she's popped up a lot in Scum list building. I can see that would be good. And then Lima in the Y-Wing. And then at the bottom for Scum, the most nerfed ones, we've got Genesis Red. Poor Genesis Red. Genesis Red's ability is so interesting, but her initiative is so bad that it just doesn't work. I would love to see justice for Genesis. Something to give Genesis Red some life to actually be worth taking. Like right now, it's just so bad, so bad. Then we've got the generic YT 1300. No surprise. The generic Lock Revenant, no surprise. And then the generic YV666. Okay. Yeah, this is really interesting data to look at, and there is a lot more to this. One thing that I'm really looking at is as I'm list building with each individual faction, I'm making a short list of not necessarily overlooked pilots, but standout pilots. Standout pilots where they are really interesting or spicy for a variety of reasons at their current points value at the 50-point spread. One that immediately comes to mind for Scum is Gargol, whatever, the G4 thing. Where is that? Let's see if he's on this list. Um, he's the Seek Interceptor. Is it Gargor? His name is half letters and half numbers. I always mess this up. Um, where the M3A doesn't even make the list, I don't think, unless he's near the top somewhere. Ooh, so this doesn't even include all pilots. That's interesting. Yeah, Gargor comes up because he is very cheap for kind of chassis in that space, and he has enough loadout value to actually take auto blasters, which really ups his close range offense and gives him actual meaningful forward offense up close where he wants to be. So it's a combination of his pilot ability, kind of play style, and squad cost, all lining up to make him a really interesting piece to finish out a squad, especially in that 7 points cost, which is pretty tight for Scum. Scum doesn't have a lot to play with in that space aside from your named mining guild ties, which there is no reason to take mining guild ties. Um, Especially without the talent. Like the only thing I would take them for is that Mark Sable closure, and none of the ones that are worth taking for a 1 point talent, even to do free strains. It's not. So it's interesting space. So Gargor jumped out as one that actually is a really good low cost ship to kind of fill your gaps in your lists. That was one that stood out. And there are some other ones as well. And I'm kind of looking at each individual faction one by one, and I look forward to coming in to report my findings on that one. Anyway, that's a quick update that has now taken a long time. If you're still with me, cheers. Happy flying. We'll talk soon.